Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to African Political Thought. We've reached the stage of the lecture series now when you can have some fun. In other words, rather than discussing the thinking, the ideas, the philosophical thought of great leaders or not so great leaders, we're looking today at the thought as expressed in the creative arts on the parts of those who are meant to have been led by these great figures of African politics, and how they reacted to political directions that were thought into place purportedly and then used to justify being led into interesting places. Very few of the African leaders, including the thoughtful ones, led their people, led their states into the green pastures that were promised. And to be perfectly fair, it was probably impossible to realize in one generation the dreams that had formed in the long struggle for independence, in the long struggle for statehood. Even so, what you have is the beginnings of all kinds of possibilities for the future. Certainly, in terms of some of the possibilities of Africa, there's been an interesting development in terms of its music and in terms of its literature. Almost everyone now has got a favorite African musician or a favorite African author. The international success of writers like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, for instance, the author of Half a Yellow Sun, basically looking back at the modern history of Nigeria, looking back at the terrible civil war that racked the country from the late 1960s into the early 1970s, that kind of retelling, that kind of description and depiction of suffering that accompanied the traumas, basically were part of the traumas of independence. All of that kind of thing has now entered into an international consciousness. And of course, just last year, one of the big sellers in the American literary lists was that new book, The Old Drift, by the Zambian author, Namwali Serpell. Namwali I've cooked for in my kitchen. I knew her when she was a little girl, and basically she is Zambia's great literary sensation, not in terms of local appreciation, but very, very much in terms of an international appreciation, often prefaced by many people who've come across this book, Where the Hell is Zambia? So in many ways, literature is leading the way. And you have the work of people like Bettina Gappa from Zimbabwe, people like Tsitsi Dankaremba, also from Zimbabwe, who was in the news very recently for having been arrested in demonstrations against the regime of Emerson Mnangagwa. So you have, as it were, a participation of literature in politics, and you have an appreciation of literature emerging from Africa, almost as if it was something new. But in fact, people have been writing in African jurisdictions for a very, very long time now. Not all of it was accessible in English. For instance, if you look again in Zambia at the early writing in Bemba, the northern language of Zambia, of Stephen Mpashe, then what you're looking at is an account in Bemba, which the colonial authorities could not always fully understand, telling the stories of how there was native unrest underneath colonial rule that all the same put itself aside to participate in the wars that the imperial powers fought against each other. Zambian soldiers going off to fight in World War II, for instance, and how exposure to the world in this way changed them, changed their sense of national consciousness as it changed their sense of international consciousness. So the point I want to make right away is that there's always been a sense of internationalism about African literature, and also with music. When you look at the great music of Fela Kuti in Nigeria, dissident music, and you look at the cross-cutting influences that fed into that music and the influences that music gave to others in, for instance, the United States, what came to be called Fela's Afrobeat, then you have, as it were, an internationalization of cross-pollination. That was always the case from the very, very start of the so-called colonial era, in the sense that jazz was something which was resonant on both sides of the Atlantic. It was resonant between France and African countries, and New Orleans, Paris, Racing Club Paris. All of these were influences that went to Africa, and African influences were transmitted back to the metropolitan centers. Basically, senses of rhythm that had originally derived from Africa were given amplification, almost literally, in terms of modern instruments like the saxophone, like the electrified guitar. And the fusion that developed meant that you had an internationalism as well as giving rise to national musics with national purposes. In the case of Fela Kuti, in the 1970s, to protest against the military government of President Obasanjo. It was very, very much an era of great turmoil in Nigeria. Obasanjo eventually, and very much according to a plan that he'd released, a transparent plan, democratized Nigeria once again. And what you had was very, very much in that intervening period between military rule and its giving way to civilian rule in Nigeria, you had the military sometimes running amok. So that they were going to teach this dissident musician, Fela Kuti, a lesson, and they killed his mother, giving rise to Fela Kuti's probably most famous song about taking the coffin of his mother to the gate of the military barracks and making the soldiers accept the coffin of his mother. And what is often forgotten in all of this is that Fela Kuti, although living a dissident lifestyle, he had his own independent republic, let us say a commune in which he had a backing group of female wives, and where a very great deal of drug smoking took place. What you had in this dissident lifestyle was also a dissident politics that was not in any sense working class. And Fela Kuti was the cousin of Woye Soyinka, whose work we'll discuss later. And what you had was a dissident musician affecting this bohemian lifestyle, a true dissident, a true musician, who all the same was connected to the literary sections of society. The mother had been a pioneering feminist in Nigeria. So you had this sense of an intellectual elite, a creative elite, that all the same was prepared from early days to be involved in protest movements that were politically oriented. Now, this set a theme for a lot of Africa throughout the years of independence, up until now, as the case of Tsitsi Dangaremba epitomizes. There's almost no separation of creativity and politics. So those of you who are wanting to write for your assessments about your own favorite author or your own favorite musician or artist and how they have impacted upon politics, if you wanted to analyze their own political thought, the nature of their dissidents, then this is the moment in which you can be creative and still satisfy the requirements of this course. But you have, as it were, as I said, not a sudden new explosion. This has been going on for a long time. The case of Zambia's Stephen Mpashe writing in Bemba is only one case in point. You had in Nigeria, for instance, even during the colonial era, and certainly in the early era of independence after 1960, the equivalent of the Victorian phenomenon of what they called penny dreadful novels in the Victorian times in Great Britain. For a penny, now you could buy what we would now call a trash novel, a romance, an adventure, an invention, particularly of the South Seas and the Maori people, the savage tribes of the South who stood and fought against colonialism. You could have African adventures. There would be trash novels written without too much thought or research, but they could be afforded by working people. In Nigeria, no one's really sat down to write the definitive study of this, but in Nigeria and many other locations, you certainly have the equivalent of penny dreadful novels. You've got to imagine Moose and Boone romance and some kind of spurious science fiction creation. In other words, Europe was imagined just as Europe once imagined Africa and imagined the South Seas. For sale, churned off printing presses, cheap backyard printing presses, and they expressed not just a sense of fantasy and adventure, they expressed also, hidden between the lines, a critique of colonial rule. All of this has been formalized into a high literature, a canon of post-colonial literature, for want of another word, and I'll return to that word in a minute. It's created a canon of established writers in Nigeria, people like Warrior Soyinka, as I said, in Zimbabwe. You've got people that I'll discuss later, like Yvonne Vera, in all of the jurisdictions, including in Kenya and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. You've got, as it were, these almost received gods of literature. Warrior Soyinka has won the Nobel Literature Prize. Every year there's speculation, is it finally going to be Ngugi's turn? It's actually a scandal. He hasn't received the Nobel Prize for Literature. But let's start, indeed, with Ngugi. When we take up from last week's lecture on Thabo Mbeki, what you had in 2003, when the land nationalizations in Zimbabwe were not only still continuing, but obviously beginning to cause huge economic meltdown in Zimbabwe, there was a very great move to begin the international isolation of Zimbabwe as very, very much a sanction against this kind of preemptory action that was dispossessing people and ruining the economic fabric of the country. This was an international effort to isolate Zimbabwe, purportedly, hopefully, to bring it to its senses. It didn't, of course, but led by Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of this country, and he was opposed in Commonwealth councils by Thabo Mbeki, the President of South Africa. And the crunch came in 2003 at a Commonwealth high-level meeting in Abuja in Nigeria. Mbeki went to this conference absolutely certain that he could command a majority. He was relying on the African votes and the black vote, the Pan-African vote around the world. Blair masterly isolated and took away from Mbeki's expected total the votes of Ghana and Kenya, and garnered all of the black Caribbean votes and also all of the South Pacific votes. Mbeki hadn't thought of trying to lobby those locations outside of Africa, but this was outside of the South Pacific, of course, but certainly the Caribbean, part of the Pan-Africa that he had spoken about in terms of his dreams of an African Renaissance. It was Blair who adroitly commandeered their support, and Zimbabwe was suspended from the Commonwealth, and the regime of sanctions, which Britain had begun, was endorsed. And basically sanctions of one sort or another have continued to this present day. And Mbeki was furious at being outmaneuvered. He was never very good at calculating political odds in any case, which is precisely how Jacob Zuma finally outmaneuvered him, seized the party leadership of the ANC from him. And the ANC have a tradition that in order to be president of the country, you must also be the recognized president of the ANC. So as a result of miscalculating the amount of support that Zuma was able to achieve at an ANC party conference, Mbeki fell from grace and fell from power. So he was not able to predict the odds in the ANC at the conference in Polokwane. He was not able to predict the odds that swung against him at Abuja at the Commonwealth Conference, which was won in terms of its key and central issue by Tony Blair. But Mbeki stormed back to South Africa and wrote one of his famous or infamous weekly newsletters to the ANC. I said last week that these tended to be literary masterpieces rather than anything that anyone could readily understand. A rank and file member of the ANC certainly was not going to understand many of the literary allusions that Mbeki was prone to put into his newsletters. But on this occasion, he riffed off the work of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan novelist, who was also a considerable essayist. And he basically cited Ngugi's great essay, Decolonizing the Mind, which really was the first usage of the term decolonizing, decolonization. Almost everything that we speak about now in terms of the decolonial project began with this particular essay, which in turn began as a series of lectures, the Douglas Robb lectures, at, of all places, the University of Auckland in New Zealand in 1984. Now, most people would trace the post-colonial movement, certainly the post-colonial literary movement, to 1989 at the University of Kent, where the Commonwealth Literature Association was hosting one of its regular jamborees, and Edward Said was the keynote speaker at that particular event. And in fact, he had rehearsed his book before it was published, Culture and Imperialism, at the University of Kent. I met Said on this particular occasion because I also was speaking at that conference. And Said basically put it to the assembled delegates, why are you still calling this Commonwealth literature? Surely you must find a term that takes you beyond an era which, for better or for worse, still resonates with the era of colonization. And in a stroke, post-colonial studies was invented, but there was a problem with the invention of post-colonial studies because it was just a new name for Commonwealth literature that was written in English. And how can you decolonize, for instance? How can you be post-colonial and still use only one language, which just happened to be the language of a very, very key player, one of the majority players along with France, in the entire colonial epoch? It was, as it were, a movement that was resonant with political correctness. It certainly began the serious study of literatures that arose from the periphery, but all the same maintained all the privileges of the Metropolitan Academy. But how do you decolonize beyond that? This is where I think the true foundation of post-colonial studies was not 1989. It wasn't what happened as a result of Said's intervention at the University of Kent. It was 1984 at the University of Auckland, when Ngugi basically gave his lectures, which later were published as Decolonizing the Mind. And he basically said point blank, look, from now on, even though I've made a huge international reputation for myself as a novelist, as a playwright, writing in English, and indeed he had some very great books that came from his pen, he said, from now on, I am not going to publish in English. I'm going to publish in Kikuyu. It's my language. I grew up with Kikuyu. And I think that the uses of a metropolitan language also reflect certain metropolitan ways of thinking. In other words, the linguistic construction of language in a very, very real way not only reflects the way you think, but conditions the way you think. To be, as it were, able to think oneself anew in authentic terms, in decolonial terms, requires one to think and write, to express oneself in one's own language. And what Mbeki did was to say, look, we've got to rethink ourselves in our own terms and not rely on the leadership of the metropole, certainly not as personified by people like Tony Blair. It was a savage newsletter. He was clearly very, very angry. But Mbeki never said how. And there are problems in trying to express the how. In terms of Ngugi's own determination to write in Kikuyu, what did this mean just in the context of Kenya? Why not write in Luo, the other major language alongside Kikuyu, both of them alongside many other languages in Kenya? And of course, the political divides which have been exploited in election after election until very recently in Kenya could almost be configured along lines of linguistic groups that were also ethnic groups between Luo and Kikuyu. Was Ngugi, in making a statement against the domination of the metropole, in fact, in some ways, perhaps unconsciously, endorsing a certain domination in the national context of Kenya? And there are other problems as well in terms of using a language to express oneself in the modern world. He referenced a PhD thesis on a scientific subject that was submitted and accepted by Cornell University in New York State, written in Kikuyu. But it was a scientific PhD, and the number of loan words, scientific terms borrowed from English in order to render this into a properly scientific and a rigorously scientific PhD were so numerous that the question one immediately asked was, what is the efficacy of a language in the modern world if it cannot express the modern world? If it is able to express the modern world by all kinds of borrowings, and you've got, as it were, interlinguistic cooperation, is this perhaps not a more honest way to say how one should go about a certain project to do with authenticity? There are loan words, loan expressions in almost all language groups. To say that one is fully autochthonous and is able to make its way internationally because of its national foundation is a form of autarky which may not always work very well, and in fact may serve to isolate you in the world at large, because who is going to read the Kikuyu? We still read Ngugi's novels today, the new ones, post-1984, but they've been translated into English. And in terms of his earlier novels that were written in English and published in English, what you have is an attempt to tell the Kenyan nationalist story in a dissident way. Don't forget that after independence in Zimbabwe, the new independent regime, led by Jomo Kenyatta, was very, very much affronted by the image that the struggle for liberation had achieved for itself internationally. In particular, the so-called atrocities of the Mau Mau fighters. And what was hidden at that point in time, but which have been revealed in successive recent court cases, was the atrocities committed by the colonial authorities in terms of fighting the Mau Mau. Now, in fact, there were certainly atrocities on both sides, But to disavow your own history, to disavow the history of your liberation struggle, is something that is really quite a stupendous decision to make. Now, what happened after independence was that the Mau Mau were disavowed, its leaders were given very polite positions of no import and hidden away. I met one of them once. He was basically famous during the years of the struggle for liberation by the pseudonym, the war name General China. So when I met him, he was commander of the National Youth Program in Kenya, which was a very, very polite way of providing, as it were, quasi-military but also developmental training to young people who were otherwise unemployed. And those people who were escorting me to visit the headquarters of this movement whispered to me afterwards, "Do you know who that was? That was General China," who was able, I hasten to add, to pour a cup of English tea in exactly the English gentlemanly fashion. But the disavowal of this was something which offended Ngugi. So in what I think is still his greatest novel, written in English, Petals of Blood, what you have are a group of outcasts from respectable society in the newly independent Kenya, people who would be regarded as the riffraff by polite elite political society, people out in the rural areas coming together, a prostitute, a former Mau Mau fighter, the down and outs of society. And they decide, this small motley band, to march upon Nairobi to say, look, here we are. We were the ones who were marginalized back then under colonialism. We fought against colonialism and were marginalized now. And the novel Petals of Blood is about their march towards Nairobi, telling stories from their own histories and their own culture as they march towards Nairobi. The interesting thing about this novel is that it's constructed along the lines of W.B. Yeats's poem about the beast slouching towards Bethlehem. In fact, every single section of the book is prefaced by an epigram from that Yeats poem. Now, Yeats, of course, was himself an Irish poet of liberation. He supported the struggle against the British in terms of achieving independence for Ireland from Great Britain. To that extent, it was an apt choice. But taking a poem written in English, famous in the English literature curriculum, in fact, a perfectly wrought poem in many, many ways, perfectly written, and using that as the source of the epigrams that marked out the different stages of the march to protest the lack of freedom and the fulfillment of dreams in a novel about post-colonial Kenya, in a novel written, as I say, in English, this suggested that you really sometimes have got to have a view of the world which is from the very start cosmopolitan, that you have to accept that a national project in modern times necessarily sits within an international context. Now, that's a very, very controversial thing to say, but there's a contradiction in Ngugi. I think he should have won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think he should have won it a long, long time ago. He's very clearly a great writer. But this particular essay of his, which has been stupendously successful, although I hasten to add, not many people seem actually to have read it, and of those who have read it, almost no one actually speaks Kikuyu here in the metropole. What you've got is really a problematic start to the whole post-colonial or the decolonial movement. All the same, it stands as a particular point in time where literature, or at least a piece of essay-esque writing, written by someone famous for his creative literature, for his novels and for his plays, that stands very, very much as a political expression which probably could not come in any were like the same way from the political ruling elite. So when you have Mobutu's authentic program, his policies of authenticity, none of us expressed in this creative way that Ngugi was able to use in his own work and in the subsequent work to 1984. But this contradiction bestrides, as it were, all modern thought on the decolonial movement. To what do you decolonize? What is the status quo ante? And as I've said, you've got the additional problematic in that when you do write in your own language, what inflections into that language were imparted by the missionaries who first basically inscribed your language into its written form. So all kinds of dissent and difficulties may have come from those moments of inscription. Maybe these are problems that are simply part of the adaptation of any language to the changing of time. But the purity that is implicit in the decolonial movement is simply not able to be sustained underneath examination. Certainly one should recreate oneself, and that is what one is doing, because the status quo ante cannot be ascertained in its original purity, and it cannot be ascertained in a way which is directly relevant to the modern world. But the recreation of oneself is a different project to the one that seeks to go only backwards. So when you look at other great novelists in today's Africa, you're looking at people who want to go forward. In that sense, Ngugi stands almost as an antiquarian. If you look at the work of Namali Sopel, the Zambian author, what you've got in this book, The Old Drift, is really a history of independent Zambia. And it begins with the Zambian space program. Oh yes, there was a space program. Fascinated by the space race at that point in time. Don't forget that Zambia had gotten independence in 1964. It was only in 1957 that the Soviets got their first satellite into space, a Sputnik, which has given its name to the Russian vaccine against COVID being distributed in Africa today. But really, the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States caught everybody's imagination. And there was this question, well, why can't we in Africa also participate in the space race? So almost like a form of homemade, appropriate technology, an entrepreneur tried to create a Zambian space program. It was in some ways comical, it was in other ways extremely daring, and extremely nationalistic in the sense of saying, look, why can't Africa also have a place in the world of science? It's a big question. So what was reported internationally as a ridiculous movement, almost as it were reported in satirical terms, was nonetheless an assertion of nationalism and national pride, which said we want to be modern. We want to be up there along with people who are involved in putting satellites into space, and who knows, perhaps eventually a man or a woman into space. So one of the Zambian astronauts was indeed a woman who trained underneath appropriate technology conditions, and she certainly caught the imagination of the international press and of the national press. And the president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, endorsed the space program, even though, of course, it had no hope of becoming an actuality. Now, Zambians in the years that followed became embarrassed by this. What Namali Sopel does in her novel, The Old Drift, is to recapture this moment of pure adventurism to the point of fantasy, which is precisely why it makes a good novel, and to use it as the starting point for a history of Zambia told in novelistic form. And it's this kind of retelling of oneself, of one's country, but using imagination, of using not so much prescription, which is a key ingredient of political thought as it verges towards ideology, for instance, but using the imagination to ask questions of what if, what could have been, what might still be. And of course, what might still be also allows a more properly political dimension. Because what you have is very often, particularly in one-party states, dominant party states, authoritarian states, is the inflection of alternative political programs. And constantly throughout African literature is the theme of we want to be free. In other words, the struggle for freedom in Africa, that struggle didn't end with political decolonization. It continues to this day. And it's the artists, the musicians, and the writers who most reflect this desire for freedom. They also reflect the experience of disappointment that freedom has not come. I'll say a few things now that will carry over into next week's lecture, where among other things we'll be discussing the work of Frantz Fanon and his treatment of trauma that is caused by colonialism and the struggle against colonialism. And don't forget that The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon's great work, has an entire significant section which is to do with psychoanalytic case studies of people suffering who had suffered trauma as a result of retribution by the French authorities in Algeria. What you have is this idea of trauma not as something which is terrible. It is expressed as a terrible experience, moments of madness, moments of frenzy. But the idea of trauma as a natural part of the national condition, as the national condition seeks to realize itself. It's there even in bestsellers like Adichie's Half a Yellow Sun, because of course the Nigerian Civil War was not something gentle, it was devastating. The country was almost like the American Civil War, divided and torn apart. Full armies threw themselves in the field against each other. The casualty rate, the so-called collateral casualty rate in terms of starvation, particularly of children, was just enormous. And this was captured by the international press. Don McCullen's photographic testimonies about starving children in what was called Biafra, the secessionist state in Nigeria, those were among some of the most graphic images of their day. So you have, as it were, a record of trauma in more ways than one. It is reflected in Adichie's novel, but all the same, it's a novel about middle-class people. What you have in terms of some of the novels that came out of Zimbabwe was trauma on the part of those who either fought, and they did not come from elite middle-class backgrounds, or trauma suffered by those, particularly women, suffered by women at the hands of those who had fought, and those who had fought were traumatized to the extent that they could only express themselves by raping and disfiguring women. And the work of Yvonne Vera, the late Yvonne Vera, is very significant in this regard. Probably my favorite novel coming out of Zimbabwe, if not from almost all other parts of Africa. There is one other that is a greater favorite of mine. But let us say one of the great favorites is the work by Yvonne Vera, The Stone Virgins. And the title, The Stone Virgins, refers to cave drawings. Young women from a bygone era, drawings on caves by generations, hundreds if not thousands of years ago that have survived. But this cave is the hideout of the traumatized former guerrilla fighter. And it's from this cave that he emerges to wreak all kinds of terrible things upon women. And the book is written in such an elegant way that I've had friends and associates who never realized that the one particular harrowing scene actually described the step-by-step process of murdering someone, cutting her throat, because they're dancing a tango at that particular time. And the killer and his victim are described in this tango, step by step, and suddenly she's dead. And I had people coming to me saying, but look, how does she suddenly, on the next page, appear dead? And I had to tell them, look, this action, can you dance the tango? Do you know this particular movement? And this movement is identical to the movement that you use when, with a knife, you cut the throat of a sheep. You see this in slaughterhouses and abattoirs all the time, for instance. It's also the stroke used by ISIS executioners when they're executing their prisoners, being forced to kneel in their orange uniforms. Basically, this is a stroke of cutting another's throat. Do it deeply enough, it's a single stroke that can decapitate. And this is a stroke which you find in the tango. And of course, when you explain this to people, they're horrified. It suddenly becomes a novel of terror, a terrible novel. But to disguise terror in such an elegant way is in fact a considerable accomplishment. And in fact, the reader should have been forewarned, because the very first chapter of the novel was set in pre-independence Bulawayo, the second city of Zimbabwe, and is set among the jazz clubs of the city. And indeed, Bulawayo was a city of jazz nightclubs. The great jazz classic Skokian was in fact composed by a Zimbabwean jazz musician in Bulawayo. And you had the sense of a musical setting. If someone actually ever makes a film of the Stone Virgins, then in fact it should be a film set to jazz, to locally composed jazz. And the acts of terror should have this kind of musical accompaniment. So some kind of jazz-inflected rendition of the tango would be perfect for this particular scene. But I'm saying this in terms of expressing the artfulness in this novel of being able to express trauma. The other great novel of trauma to come out of Zimbabwe by Alexander Kanangoni, about spirit possession, which happens as a result of a young guerrilla fighter who was forced to execute an innocent female villager and the child she carried on her back, and the spirit of the woman comes back to haunt him. This novel about possession and being driven mad by a spirit of vengeance, until redemption could only be gained by the death of the former fighter who had to carry out this execution. This entire novel, the entire length of the novel, is one of the slow motion development of frenzy towards the moment of death to requite the earlier death that he had been called upon to execute. And to maintain that kind of momentum of terror and frenzy, again, is a considerable literary accomplishment. So you have literature of a very sophisticated sort coming out of Africa. But probably the greatest site of literature in Africa, in its Anglophonic sense in any case, comes from Nigeria. People like Chinua Achebe, the Anthos of the Savannah, and of course people like Warrior Soyinka. Now, Soyinka served time in prison, a military prison, during the Nigerian Civil War. He was not happy with the war. After his release, he has written a long series not only of novels and plays, but indeed of essays protesting against successive governments in Nigeria. He's been a fully public intellectual, the running sore of the continent. He's described the country in those terms: the corruption, the lack of value accorded to human life, and the lack of value accorded to individual human volition. And there's a legend that his name, Soyinka, actually comes from his time in prison during the Civil War. The legend is that it means shit made out of, or rather ink made out of shit, Inca, because that's all he could write with on toilet paper while he was in prison, making ink out of his own feces. Now, in fact, that's an apocryphal story. It's a romantic story in its own strange way. He wouldn't have had toilet paper anyway in the prisons of the military establishment in Nigeria, but has cemented his reputation as a man of integrity and as a man of extreme individual views that were not to be sold to the political establishment. But he was also a novelist who spoke of the difficulties of making the transition from the pre-independence period to the post-independence period. Basically, in making the transition to the post-colonial, or making the transition perhaps to the beginning of a long process of the decolonial. And this novel, which is still my favorite, The Interpreters, talks about a group of young people. They've just graduated from university. They're not unlike yourselves. And they're asking themselves the question, what are we going to do with ourselves? So the title, The Interpreters, is about how shall we interpret the world? With what values, with what methodology should we imprint our interpretation of the world upon the world? Can we do it? Should we even try? Should we simply seek out to do the best for ourselves without thinking about values at all? In other words, the sorts of questions that young people all around the world ask at precisely this moment in life. And this sense of wondering, this sense of not quite confusion, but a sense of in which direction do we start? How do we set out? That's captured perfectly in his book, The Interpreters. He wrote a huge number of other great works as well, and he's become sufficiently famous internationally that no government dares to touch him. And the literary festival that is held in his hometown of Abiauka on a regular occasion attracts international delegates. People want to be there as one of the great literary festivals of the world. So you have, as it were, an internationalization just in terms of the respect paid to him, which protects him in his own country, just like Ngugi is now essentially protected in his own country. He's gone back to Kenya after many years of exile. He was himself imprisoned by one of the post-independence governments in Kenya. And essentially you have literature as a site of permissible dissidence, provided you don't take it too far. In other words, if you're writing a novel and you call out the current authoritarian president by his name, that's going to get you back into prison. But the creative, inflective capacity of literature is something that you can run with. And if you're going to look at dissident political thought in Zimbabwe today, then you're going to look at literature. You're also going to look at music. So again, if you return to the Zimbabwean example, you had just 1 week ago the interview given by Thomas Mapfumo, one of the great musicians at the time of independence in Zimbabwe. His music inspired many of the people who fought against white minority rule. But Mapfumo, who was very outspoken then, was outspoken again in terms of his defiance of the current government in Zimbabwe. He does so from exile. Someone who did so from within the country and who's now died. Someone who really should have been regarded as a great musician, more so internationally than he has been. And I, in fact, proposed him for an honorary doctorate at SOAS. SOAS was going through one of its very conservative phases at that moment in time, and basically declined to do so. But he recorded a great album called Buvuma. The key song of Buvuma, this is, of course, the musician Oliver Mutukudzi. The great song is about standing down because you're too old. Now, this was a direct comment to Robert Mugabe. Too old. We respect you because you're old, but you're too old. And this became one of the great #1 hits in Zimbabwe. You couldn't stop people singing it. Everyone knew what it meant. No one could stop the singing of this song. Mugabe wasn't named, but everyone knew the name that was inferred in the song. And so what you had with Mutukudzi was the sense of being able to make commentary of a critical sort upon society and upon political society, while at the same time also setting a huge example in terms of conduct nationally. A philanthropist, a feminist, someone who was committed to the education of young people, someone who basically had a wild youth. I remember stumbling upon a bar, a nightclub in 1982 in which he was performing. I turned out to be the only non-white member of this raucous beer hall basic performance of his early music. But I thought at the time, but this is really quite amazing. Who is this man? This was in the era before he was known outside of Zimbabwe. Well, he's known now, although he no longer appreciates it by virtue, unfortunately, of having passed away. But you have on record, in sound, as in the case of Fela Kuti, a catalogue of dissidents. Now, you can be put to use by the regime as well. You can be a hired gun of the regime. This has happened to a number of musicians. It's less successfully done, this kind of capture, on the part of regimes trying to second writers, authors, novelists to the regime's cause. You can't sustain, as it were, this kind of, for want of another word, how should I put this politely? Well, I'll just use the word that came into my mind anyway. Please forgive me. You can't sustain this kind of ass-licking over a 200 to 300 page novel and still make it into a successful novel. So you have, as it were, a political condition amenable to literary critique. And with the arrest of people like Tsitsi Dangarembga in the recent Zimbabwean protests, it made headlines. Full-page splash feature in the Sunday newspapers here in Great Britain and The Observer. The police knew she was famous and treated her to a very polite night in the cells. She didn't actually suffer very much. She made the most of it, as indeed she should have, to publicize what it was that she was protesting against on a day of national protest. And in this way, a solidarity was achieved and an international publicization of what was intended by the protests was achieved. So even in the most polite way, authors still play their part. Now, all over Africa, in almost every single country you can think of, this goes on. So much so that it was almost, as it were, a key feature of governments of white minority rule, like the apartheid government, particularly in the time when it was the government also of Namibia, then called Southwest Africa. It achieved a colonial-style ownership of Namibia. There was a liberation movement which struggled very hard to make headway. It didn't really make that much headway. But what you had was a discouragement of expression, even on the part of those who were not going to take up a militant form of protest, so that the very first novel written by a Namibian, and even then it was co-authored, didn't come out until just 10 years before independence was finally achieved. The apartheid government knew very, very well that literature could be a sword that could be used against it. Now, there are great South African writers today. There's a huge publishing industry in South Africa. People have written about the terrors of apartheid. People have written about the hopes for the future. Everywhere people write about the hopes for the future. What are the dreams of the writers? Obviously, everyone seeks for a just future. Everyone seeks in particular for a future without trauma. So let me conclude today's lecture with something I'll take up next week, the whole condition of trauma. And I think I've referred to this before, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born by Amar, Ghanaian writer, in which the central motif of the entire novel, and this is my favorite novel to come out of Africa, in fact it's one of my overall favorite novels, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. The centralizing motif is shit, it's feces. Everywhere in the New Ghana there is shit. And even at the end of the novel, when the protagonist manages to escape from people who want to kill him because he refuses to participate in corruption, he escapes their bloodlust by crawling through a sewer, which emerges, he emerges along with shit, and sees a single flower at the mouth of the sewage pipe, light at the end of the pipe, light at the end of the tunnel, and a flower, a beautiful flower. Of course, the novel closes at that moment, but you realize when you close the covers that this flower is fertilized by shit. So what you have in literature is the recognition also of a contradiction. In other words, one is not writing about utopia. You're seeking for justice, you're seeking for an end of trauma. You're not necessarily seeking for perfection. And in this way, the African novel is a more realistic novel than almost novels anywhere else. There's a form of magical realism, a sort of form, and Gugi tried this, it didn't really work, but a form all the same of magical realism beginning to infuse some African literary efforts. But at the end of the day, you have essentially psychological case studies and novels of realism about the down and dirty nature of trying to achieve an authenticity that speaks to freedom. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to me today.